Harrison Ford, the man behind the myth. What if the biggest movie star on the planet almost never became famous at all? What if, instead of ruling Hollywood, he spent his days sanding wood and fixing cabinets, completely invisible to the world? That's not a hypothetical. That's the real story of Harrison Ford. And after more than 5 decades in the spotlight, he's finally opened up about the things that shaped him the most: his first marriage, the chaos of Star Wars, and a secret that stayed buried for nearly 40 years. But here's the thing: this isn't just a celebrity story. It's about what happens when ordinary life collides with extraordinary fame, and what gets lost in the collision. Let's go back to where it all started. Picture Los Angeles in the early 1960s. Not the glamorous version you see in the movies. The real one, gritty, competitive, full of people chasing something they can't quite name. Somewhere in that city, a young man named Harrison Ford is doing something nobody would ever associate with Hollywood royalty. He's building cabinets, installing shelves, showing up to construction jobs with calloused hands, and no guarantee of anything better. Ford didn't stumble into acting because of some burning childhood dream. He came to it the way most people come to things: through necessity, through trying, through failing, and trying again. He landed small television roles here and there, the kind of parts that come and go without leaving a mark. He signed with Columbia Pictures at one point, got released, and quietly went back to his toolbox. Most people in that position would have given up. Ford didn't. But he also didn't bet everything on it. Then, in 1964, something personal changed. He married a woman named Mary Marquardt. And this is important, because this was not a Hollywood love story. There were no red carpets, no tabloid headlines. It was two people figuring out life together during genuinely uncertain times. Ford was juggling auditions and job sites. Marquardt was holding the household together. In 1966, their son Benjamin was born. In 1969, their second son Willard arrived. Ford was a father now, a husband, a carpenter, and an actor, in roughly that order of reliability. This is the version of Harrison Ford that most people never talk about. The guy who wasn't famous. The guy who wasn't sure he ever would be. Now here's where the story shifts. Through his carpentry work, Ford ended up crossing paths with a filmmaker named George Lucas. He appeared in a small role in American Graffiti, which kept him loosely connected to Lucas's orbit. When Lucas began casting for a new science fiction project, something ambitious, something risky, something most people in Hollywood weren't sure about, Ford found himself in the room. And not even as an auditionee, exactly. He was there to read lines with other actors, helping Lucas test how the dialogue actually sounded out loud. But something unexpected happened. Every time Ford opened his mouth as Han Solo, the character stopped being a concept and started being a person. The dry humor, the casual edge, the way he delivered sarcasm like it was fact. It wasn't in the script, it was just Ford. And Lucas noticed. The production that followed was, by all accounts, a controlled disaster. Filming took place at Elstree Studios in England and across scorching desert locations in Tunisia. Scripts were being rewritten on the fly. Technical problems showed up daily. Budget pressures loomed constantly. Nobody, not the studio, not the director, not the cast, knew if this thing would actually work. Harrison Ford finished filming and went home to his family in Los Angeles, back to a life that still looked remarkably ordinary. Star Wars was just another project, another maybe. Then May 1977 arrived. The film opened in a limited number of theaters, and within days, the lines stretched around city blocks. Within weeks, the cultural conversation had completely shifted. Star Wars wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. And Han Solo was at the center of it. Audiences loved the character's edge, his unpredictability, the sense that he was doing the right thing while pretending he didn't care. That was Harrison Ford. All of it. By the time the film crossed $775 million worldwide across its various releases, Ford's life had transformed in a way that left almost no time to adjust. He went from being a working-class actor-carpenter to one of the most recognizable faces on Earth, in the space of a few months. Suddenly, Normal routines became impossible. Grocery runs turned into events. Privacy became a negotiation. And at home, the pressure of that visibility began to press against a marriage that had been built for a completely different kind of life. Here's where things get personal. During the filming of Star Wars in 1976, Harrison Ford, then 33 years old and married to Mary Marquardt, met a 19-year-old actress named Carrie Fisher, who had been cast as Princess Leia. What happened between them on set stayed quietly buried for almost 4 decades. No confirmation, no denial, just rumor living in the background of Hollywood mythology. Then, in 2016, Carrie Fisher published a memoir called The Princess Diarist, and everything changed. Fisher had kept diary entries during the filming of Star Wars and used them as the foundation for the book. What she described wasn't a scandalous exposé, it was something more complicated. A young woman, newly famous, emotionally isolated in a strange production environment, falling intensely for someone who was older, more experienced, and already spoken for. She described the relationship as lasting roughly the length of filming, about 3 months, and ending when production wrapped and everyone went their separate ways. The book was an earthquake, not because of what it revealed in isolation, but because of how long the silence had lasted. For nearly 40 years, this episode had existed only as whisper. Fisher brought it into the light not with bitterness, but with reflection. She wasn't trying to wound anyone. She was trying to understand her younger self, the girl who got swept up in something she wasn't prepared for, in circumstances that would have overwhelmed almost anyone. She also revealed that she had told Ford she planned to include the material before publication. His reaction, as she described it, was brief and guarded, a reference to lawyers, which she interpreted as concern about narrative control rather than a flat denial of what happened. Ford's own public response was minimal. He didn't deny anything. He described the situation as strange. When asked if he'd read the book, he simply said no, and beyond that, he said almost nothing. Now, and this matters, Ford himself has never pointed to this episode as the reason his first marriage ended. The divorce from Mary Marquardt came in 1979, 3 years after filming wrapped. What's true is that the timeline overlaps with one of the most chaotic transitions a person can experience, going from relative anonymity to global superstardom in the span of a year. Marriages that were built on one version of a life often struggle when that life transforms beyond recognition. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth of what was happening. Carrie Fisher went on to build a remarkable life of her own, writing with fierce honesty about relationships, addiction, mental health, and motherhood. She had a daughter, Billie Lourd, in 1992, and became one of the most candid voices in Hollywood. When Fisher passed away in December 2016, Ford released a brief statement. He called her brilliant. He called her fearless. He didn't revisit the past, he just said goodbye to someone who had mattered. By the early 1980s, Harrison Ford was rebuilding, professionally and personally. In 1981, Raiders of the Lost Ark arrived, directed by Steven Spielberg and produced by George Lucas. On a budget of around $20 million, the film became the highest-grossing movie of the year in the United States and earned 9 Academy Award nominations. Indiana Jones was a completely different character from Han Solo, but somehow, Ford made him feel just as inevitable. A rugged academic who fought Nazis and ran from boulders and managed to be charming while doing both. The physicality of the role, the stunts, the injuries, the sheer endurance required, added a layer of authenticity that audiences felt even if they couldn't name it. And in 1983, Harrison Ford got married again. His new wife was Melissa Matheson, a screenwriter best known for writing E.T. the Extraterrestrial, one of the most beloved films of the decade, grossing over $790 million worldwide. This was a pairing of 2 enormously talented people at the height of their creative powers. They built a family together. Malcolm Ford, born in 1987, and Georgia Ford, born in 1990. For a while, it worked. But Ford's career meant constant movement. Film locations scattered across Europe, the Middle East, Hawaii, Los Angeles, back and forth without end. The productions were massive. The schedules were relentless. And gradually, the distance between his world and his home life widened in ways that weren't dramatic enough to make headlines, but were real enough to matter. By 2000, Ford and Matheson separated after 17 years. The divorce was finalized in 2004. There was no public spectacle, no bitter legal war, just the quiet dissolution of something that had once been strong. Melissa Matheson passed away in 2015 from cancer, at 65. Ford didn't say much publicly, he rarely does. But the loss of someone who had shared that chapter of his life, who had raised children with him, who had built something real with him, was a weight you didn't need to narrate to understand. Then came the chapter nobody really expected. In 2002, at the Golden Globe Awards, Harrison Ford met Callista Flockhart. She was famous in her own right, the lead of Ally McBeal, one of the defining television series of the late 90s. Two very different kinds of fame, two very different career paths, meeting at a Hollywood event and finding something worth pursuing. What made this relationship different wasn't just the person, it was the timing. Ford was in his 60s. The breakneck phase of his career had settled into something more selective. He wasn't chasing franchises anymore. He was choosing carefully. And that shift, from survival mode to intentional living, changed how he approached everything, including love. The relationship developed slowly, deliberately, without the chaos that had defined earlier periods of his life. There were no overlapping productions pulling them in opposite directions, no fame explosion reshaping the ground beneath their feet. They simply grew closer, year by year, until 2009, when Ford proposed. In June 2010, they married in Santa Fe, New Mexico, quietly, away from the media machine, exactly the way Ford has always preferred to do things that actually matter to him. He also adopted Callista's son, Liam. That detail, small in the press coverage, enormous in real life, said everything about where Harrison Ford had arrived as a person. Not the action hero, not the franchise icon. A man choosing family, choosing stability, choosing to show up for something that wasn't about the camera at all. This marriage has stayed out of the headlines not because it's hiding anything, but because there's nothing chaotic to report. They live their life, they keep it private. And in Hollywood, that kind of quiet is almost radical. So what do we actually learn from Harrison Ford's story? We learn that fame doesn't arrive with a manual. It descends, fast and total, and it reshapes everything it touches, including the people and relationships around the person it targets. Ford went from carpenter to cultural icon in under 2 years, and the life he'd built with Mary Marquardt wasn't designed to survive that kind of transformation. That's not a character flaw. That's just the brutal arithmetic of sudden, overwhelming change. We learn that people carry their past with them, even when they don't talk about it. The brief, complicated overlap with Carrie Fisher stayed buried for decades, and when it finally surfaced, Ford handled it the only way he knows how, with silence, with restraint, and with a deliberate refusal to let it become a defining story. And we learn that it's possible to find stability, even after everything. Even after 2 marriages, a secret that lasted 40 years, a career that never really slowed down, and the kind of global recognition that would break most people. Harrison Ford, now in his 80s, found a version of life that actually works. Quiet, private, real. That's the story nobody tells about the man in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon. Not the stunts, not the franchises, not the box office numbers. Just a guy from Los Angeles who picked up a hammer when the world wasn't watching, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, built something that lasted. If this story hit different than you expected, you're not alone. Drop your thoughts below. Which part surprised you the most? And if you want more deep dives into the lives behind the legends, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on. There's a lot more where this came from.